All right, so let's talk a little bit about budget policies and talk about the guiding policies and practices for the budget process. So here's kind of some tips on developing a formal budget policy. So as you can see, several steps, and there's actually a formal, an example budget policy available under that useful tools link on our website. But here's kind of where we're setting overall policy. Identify what our applicable legal requirements are, and then establish a budget calendar. When are we going to do these steps in the budget process? How many funds do I have, and do they have to be budgeted? And if so, how am I going to budget those? Most of us are familiar with two of the big funds, the general fund of the city, and then a utility fund of the Public Works Authority or the utility authority. But you also have several other funds that have little pockets of money, and those are probably going to have to be budgeted also, especially if you're going to try to spend any of those other pockets of money. I've often thought about funds as I do a ugly pair of pants with 17 different pockets. You know, I've got two really big, deep pockets in the front left and right pockets, which are my two major funds. But then I've got about 15 other pockets strewn throughout the rest of the pair of pants, all that have little pockets of money that if I want to spend that pocket, I've got to do a budget for it. So we'll define what our budgetary basis of accounting is. So very simply, what that means is, when do I recognize that I have a revenue and when do I recognize that I have an expense? Most governments pretty much recognize revenue on the cash basis and the expenditures on kind of sort of a modified cash basis. So basically when I pay out the expense, or maybe when I've received the invoice and I set it up in accounts payable to pay it out next month. So it's kind of a modified cash basis on what I would call the budgetary basis in most governments. Here is also where we'll define what our appropriation approach is going to be, whether we're going to use fund balance reserves or whether we're going to try to balance the budget just on current year revenue. And we're going to define what our legal level of appropriation is. And again, state law will set a minimum level of appropriation that we have to control, but the government can actually set a more detailed limit. If they want to control the budget at every individual line item, they can actually do that. Although I would not recommend that, simply because that becomes too voluminous, especially when you have a 2,000 line item chart of accounts, and you're going to try to control the budget at each individual line item. So state law will set like a department level, legal level of control, and then let us kind of manipulate within that department as we see fit. We'll also specify our desired levels of reserves. Do we want to carry 10% of our annual revenues over every year? Do we want to carry 15%? Do we want to carry 20% or more? What is our desired level of reserves? Typically, state law and industry practice tends to set a minimum of about 10% of your main operating funds, like the general fund and your Public Works Authority fund, ought to have 10% of their annual revenues in a reserve capacity at a minimum. So 10% can easily get eaten up with one ice storm, one revenue drop, one bad utility month. I've seen reserves get eaten up. I don't think 10% is enough, but I think state law implies that as a minimum along with some industry practice. We'll also define budget amendment authority. Who gets to amend the budget? Maybe we give the manager authority to move between departments within the same fund, like from fire to police. But if we are going to take from the general fund and give it to the municipal authority or vice versa, maybe we need to have the council involved. Or if we're going to raise the general fund budget from what we originally estimated we would do, if we set $1 million, but we want to spend $1.5 million, then I would imagine that the governing body is going to have to be involved in that supplement, in that increase. And then lastly, we usually define when our appropriations lapse. In other words, are we going to take our year-end encumbrances, which are things that we've ordered but haven't came in yet, so we obviously haven't paid for them yet, and then rebudget them in the next year, or are we going to try to hold open those year-end encumbrances for, say, 90 days, hoping that that will come in? Here's where we set that budget policy, and again, there's an example of one on our website.